The first sign that something was wrong came as a tremor under the concrete, small enough that a few workers thought it might be a truck moving across the upper platform, but long enough to make others stop what they were doing and look down at the floor. Morning shifts at the Sayano-Shushenskaya Hydroelectric plant were predictable. Cold air trapped in the turbine hall, the metallic hum of machinery shaking off the night, boots clanging on steel grating. But this vibration had a different tone. It wasn't part of any startup sequence. It felt deeper, as if something buried inside the structure was straining against its own weight. A mechanic on duty walked toward Turbine 2, wiping condensation off his face as he leaned over the railing. A mist of water hissed upward from a seam beside the turbine's mounting ring, a place that should have been bone dry. He frowned and reached for his radio. Before he could speak, the vibration surged, rattling the railing under his hands. At 8:13 a.m., the turbine let go. The massive steel cover, nearly 200 tons of locked metal, shot upward with explosive force, smashing into the ceiling and sending fragments of concrete raining down in a storm of dust and debris. A column of water erupted from the chamber with the power of a ruptured dam. Catwalks twisted like wire. Heavy tool chests skidded across the floor as if gravity had been tilted sideways. Men closest to the pit disappeared instantly into the violent spray. In the control room upstairs, lights flickered and monitors went black one after another. The sound reached them a second later, an echoing boom that shook the windows and left the air vibrating like a struck cable. A technician grabbed his headset and tried to reach the turbine crew, but only static and the roar of water came through. When he stepped to the observation window, he saw only darkness and shifting shadows where the turbine floor should have been. On the level below, workers heading for a maintenance check felt the blow as a sudden blast of air and pressure. Water burst through a doorway in a solid wall of force, knocking two men off their feet and sweeping others into the narrow corridor. Lights went out instantly. In the dark, they could hear metal screaming as supports bent and tore. One man crawled up a stairwell toward what he hoped was the next level. Another tried to follow but slipped, grabbed a pipe, and held on as the surge slammed past him. The turbine's decline hadn't been a mystery. Workers had been reporting unusual vibrations for years, the kind that made floor plates buzz beneath their boots and loosened bolts that were never supposed to move. Maintenance logs should have shown every warning, every inspection, every time a technician noted instability around Turbine 2. But when investigators later opened the files, they found entries typed in identical formats, entire weeks of signatures forged, and repair orders that did not match reality. Someone had copied old logs, altered dates, and buried the real concerns under paperwork that looked complete enough to pass. Down in the turbine hall, the few survivors clung to anything that floated: toolboxes, broken railings, sections of catwalk that had snapped loose. The water churned with oil, concrete dust, and shattered equipment. A technician kicked off his boots, fighting to stay above the surface as debris slammed against him. Nearby, a shift supervisor tried to reach a ladder, but was pulled back by the current. He resurfaced once, gasping before the water swallowed him again. Outside the hall, the administrative wing shook from the shockwave. A woman sorting morning reports felt the building lurch under her feet. Ceiling tiles fell. A crack raced across the far wall. She grabbed her co-worker and ran toward the exit as alarms blared overhead. When they burst into the open air, they turned just in time to see part of the turbine hall roof collapse inward. A plume of water and pulverized concrete shot upward, sparkling in the daylight, before falling across the parking lot like cold rain. Emergency crews rushed toward the plant, but had to abandon their vehicles on the access road, which was flooded with debris. When they reached the turbine building, they found destruction that looked almost unreal. Concrete peeled open, steel beams twisted into jagged arcs, and water still hammering through the ruptured chamber with relentless force. The roar was so loud they had to shout inches from one another just to coordinate. Inside, survivors yelled for help from pockets of relative safety, bent platforms, pipes near the ceiling, or small catwalks that somehow stayed anchored. A team of responders climbed through a smashed wall panel and found two workers clinging to a beam, shaking from cold and exhaustion. They pulled them to a safer ledge, but the men kept looking toward the dark water below, searching for co-workers they knew had been down there moments before the explosion. It took nearly an hour before the internal pressure eased enough for rescuers to push deeper. They moved slowly, stepping over mangled cables and sections of floor that had folded upward. They found injured workers tangled in debris, coughing from inhaled spray. They found others farther in, men trapped beneath collapsed supports, men who had drowned in seconds when the flood surged too fast to escape. By midday, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. The turbine hall was destroyed. Lower levels were submerged. Electrical systems were ruined. Operators had barely managed to close the intake gates before the entire plant risked collapsing under the force of the reservoir. It took days to remove enough water to recover the last bodies. The final death toll reached 75. Most were turbine hall workers. Some were electricians. Others were routine employees who happened to be near the wrong door at the wrong moment. Their families gathered outside the battered plant in the days that followed, waiting for confirmation, carrying photos, scarves, and worn IDs. Investigators concluded what the workers had known long before the explosion. Turbine 2 had been failing for years, and the forged maintenance logs allowed it to run far past the limits of safety. Every vibration had been a warning. Every falsified inspection had been a step toward disaster. The blast that morning wasn't a surprise. It was the final result of problems ignored until the structure could no longer hold itself together. The turbine hall was never restored. It remained a hollow cavity of twisted steel and buckled concrete, a physical reminder of warnings unheeded and lives lost. Those who returned to work in the surviving sections of the plant passed by that scarred ruin every day, reminded of how quickly a place built for power could turn into a place of devastation. The Sayano-Shushenskaya disaster became one of the deadliest industrial failures in modern Russia, not because of a single error, but because every safeguard meant to prevent it had been brushed aside until nothing was left to stop the collapse. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.